The Edo period, also known as the Tokugawa period, was started when the Tokugawa shogunate was established in Edo, what is now modern-day Tokyo. It lasted from 1603 to 1867 and can be marked by the government of Japan's isolationist foreign policies. During this time of seclusion, Japan was strayed away from its feudal, warring times of old. Buddhism and Shintoism thrived during the Edo period, along with arts and culture. Nobles and elites in Japan were highly educated and induced themselves in these humanities. Edo Japan became a highly stratified social order, with the emperor being on top, although he really had no power, the shoguns below him who had the real power, the local and feudal daimyos and dying samurai class below the shoguns, and finally peasants and commoners and social outcasts at the bottom. Neo-Confucianism in Edo Japan promoted patrilineality, patriarchy, moral righteousness, and many other things. Economically, rice was the base of Edo Japan's economy. Urbanization became prevalent. The beginning of the end of the Edo period can be marked by Edo Japan swaying from being isolationist to being more involved in foreign affairs. Japan became technologically underdeveloped compared to their foreign counterparts, and due to this, their emperor sought help from other countries, ending Japan's isolationism. Although Western powers introduced Japan to various innovations and technologies, they also forced Japan into certain unfair treaties and contracts. Commodore Matthew Perry came to Japan, and along with blowing and setting off weapons in Edo Harbor, he forcibly insisted that Edo Japan turn away from isolationism. After a coup d'etat, Emperor Meiji came to power in 1867, and the Edo period ended. With Meiji's reign came the restoration of the emperor's imperial rule of Japan. This restoration came to be known as the Meiji Restoration. Japan became more industrialized, westernized, and modernized. Along with this, colonial and imperial interests grew among Japanese. A highly westernized and developed army compared to the rest of Eastern Asia came about. Reforms were brought to education, taxes, and other various things. Japan grew more powerful. Japan gained many territories during Emperor Meiji's rule. From 1894 to 1895, Japan fought the First Sino-Japanese War. They easily won this war as they fought the Qing dynasty's military, which was primitive in comparison to their highly westernized army. In the peace treaty, they won the Penghu Islands in Taiwan. In another 2-year war, the Japanese fought the Russo-Japanese War over imperial control of Manchuria with the Russian Empire from 1904 to 1905. The main reason why Russia lost the war was that they could not bring their military and navy from Eastern Europe and the Baltic Sea to Korea, Siberia, and Manchuria to fight the Japanese. The Russian Empire was embarrassed in front of their other Western counterparts, for they could not beat what seemed to be a measly Eastern nation. In a peace deal with Russia, Japan gained Port Arthur, half of Sakhalin Island, more influence in Manchuria, and Korea was officially part of the Japanese sphere. Along with the territories gained in the Russo-Japanese War and the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan annexed Korea in 1910 after meddling with their affairs for a long time beforehand. Emperor Meiji died in 1910. The restoration of Imperial Japan named after him was successful. The emperor that followed Meiji's death was Taisho. Emperor Taisho's reign was short and uneventful compared to Meiji and Hirohito, who came after him. Whatever it was, something was not right with him. He was physically unstable and sick. His reign can be marked by 3 things. 1. Due to Japan's alliance with the United Kingdom and their growing ambitions and involvement in current affairs, Japan entered World War I on the side of the Allies. Japan declared war on Germany in 1914, and after the war, gained various islands in the Pacific Ocean that were once under German control. 2. Troops from Japan were part of a coalition that intervened with Russia's multi-party civil war starting in 1917. They occupied parts of Siberia. This would come to be known as the Siberian Intervention. 3. Due to unhappiness for the current political system under Taisho's rule amongst Japanese persons, new parties that had socialist and communist principles emerged. This would come to be known as Taisho's democracy. Emperor Taisho stepped down for Emperor Hirohito in 1926 due to incapability to run Imperial Japan. During Hirohito's reign, support for militarism and fascism grew immensely. Just like Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, Japan grew to become a fanatical regime that saw their leader, in this case, Emperor Hirohito, as a god. The Japanese developed an idea of racial superiority over other Eastern Asian ethnicities, such as the Chinese, Koreans, Malays, etc. Some historians contribute this ideology to the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. After fighting alongside the Allies against the Central Powers, Japan was expecting to gain more in the peace deal. All they gained were a set of measly islands in the Pacific. Along with this, Japan proposed the idea of post-Great War racial equality, which would have been accepted if it weren't for the declination of this in two highly racially based and powerful societies, Great Britain and its empire, and the US. The argument is that Japan grew sour over the fact that they were screwed over in the Treaty of Versailles. Along with the rise in ultranationalism in Japan, there was a rise in the idea of the Greater East Asian Coast Prosperity Sphere, a somewhat of a faction that included Japan and its puppets. This faction saw Japan as the liberators of the non-white world, especially East Asia, which for a long time had been colonized and raped by powerful European empires. In 1931, Japan successfully invaded and conquered Manchuria, which is northeast China. Their justification for this invasion was to supposed liberation of Manchus from the Han Chinese, even though the Han Chinese were already integrated into Manchu society and culture, and the same went for Manchus, who were integrated into Han Chinese society and culture. Japan established the puppet state of Manchukuo in Manchuria and installed the last Manchu Qing emperor, Puyi, as its puppet leader. In 1933, they again invaded China, this time conquering Jehol, a region northeast of China and west of Manchuria. Again, they established a puppet, this time called Manchukuo. In 1937, Japan committed what is now sometimes looked at as the first action of World War II, when they started the Second Sino-Japanese War, using the Marco Polo Bridge incident as a justification for the war. During this war, Japan fought the Chinese United Front, a faction of Chinese states that had not been unified, for they had been fighting a civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Kuomintang and Mao Zedong's communists. Japan successfully conquered the eastern coast of China. The soldiers of Imperial Japan's army committed many atrocities, which culminated in the rape of Nanking, which was nationalist China's capital. Many Chinese civilians were slaughtered and many Chinese women were raped. Japan never fully conquered China, and this war sucked many resources away from Japan for the remainder of World War II. In 1938, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, officially allying themselves with Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy. In 1940, Japan conquered French Indochina, which was weak, for mainland France had just been conquered by Nazi Germany. In 1941, after facing oil embargoes and sanctions from the US, who did not like Japan's choices in foreign affairs, Japan did not have enough resources to fulfill their needs for conquering. Instead of taking a step back, Japan made one of the most suicidal choices in military history. In a surprise attack, Japan bombed in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and invaded the U.S. Philippines. The neutral U.S. would subsequently declare war on them and their allies. Japan then went on a conquering spree for resources to fund their war. They invaded the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, New Guinea, and various American-controlled Pacific islands. Despite the fact that they were outnumbered, outmanned, and outgunned, the Japanese managed to conquer it at an unseen speed. In the years that followed, grueling, slow, and suicidal warfare occurred on many of these Pacific areas that Japan invaded. Japan committed many war crimes against prisoners of war in these places. The so-called island hopping campaign had been proclaimed by the U.S., in which U.S. divisions would hop islands to get closer to Japan. By April 1945, Germany and Italy had surrendered, leaving Japan solo in their war affairs.
US-controlled islands were close enough to Japan for a full-scale invasion of it, but by the US and its allies. Due to the fanaticality and suicidal intentions of the Imperial Japanese, casualty estimates for the invasion numbered from 250,000 deaths to 1,000,000 deaths. Instead of invading, President Harry Truman decided to use the first ever developed atomic bombs on Japan. The US bombed the city of Hiroshima. Japan did not surrender. The US bombed Nagasaki. At first, Japan still did not surrender. Finally, Hirohito used his power over the stubbornness and fanaticality of Japanese officials, and he surrendered. After the surrender of Japan, its empire was dismantled. Hirohito was forced to denounce his fabricated divinity that had been told to so much Japanese people, and Japan, its economy, its bombed infrastructure, and its negative morale were rebuilt. The era of Imperial Japan was over.